Speed. One of the most important, if not arguably, the most important stat when it comes to determining who would win in a versus battle. Especially when it comes down to, if one hits the other, they die. So who will be the one to strike first? But when it comes to scaling characters in fiction, where almost anything is possible, a common question that is asked almost all the time: is it possible to hit tiers of speed that even go beyond massively faster than light? And if so, how many are there? What standards have to be met? What is the fastest speed tier possible? And most importantly, how can you justify these godlike levels of speed that are almost impossible to calculate and or quantify to not only exist, but to also be able to dictate one is above the other? Well, today, on another episode of Powerscaling 101, we're going to tackle all these questions, and I'll do my best to properly answer all of them. Unless you've already seen my Cosmic Treadmill video, which you should totally check out after this video, you have already been spoiled. However, this video is entirely dedicated to addressing everything about the speed tiers, but also trying to make it as digestible as possible. But first, some important disclaimers. 1. Although a lot of information about the speed tiers, especially the terms, are derived from Versus Battle Wiki, however, they're most definitely not safe from criticism, as I and many others have some major disagreements with how they define certain speed tiers, which will be the main focus of this video. And of course, I will be presenting the arguments for why their definitions don't hold up, and present just justifications for why my interpretation of these tiers would be more consistent. 2. I will not be going in depth about the differences between travel, combat, and reaction speeds in this video. That topic in itself deserves its very own video, so please wait till that video comes out before rushing to the comments saying that I should have brought it up. This video is already going to be complicated enough for those unfamiliar with power scaling. 3. As we get into things being faster than light, that's where things will get the most wordy and complicated. This may be pretty obvious to anybody, but it wouldn't be fair if I didn't at least warn you. Although there's not much to talk about when it comes to the very bottom tiers, plus I doubt anyone really cares about them, but I will address them anyway for the sake of the video. 4. I'll be mainly talking about what the standards are to be considered as a part of that tier of speed, so to avoid any nitpicks from biased normies in the comments, I'll only stick to using characters as on-screen examples that would be, or are generally accepted to be that fast by the vast majority of people. I'm already diving head deep into quite a bit of controversy as a result of this video, and I don't need anyone coming at me because a certain character I mentioned is way faster or slower than what I said. 5. This is not in any way intended to be a be-all and end-all. It would be incredibly arrogant and disingenuous for anyone to try and claim something like that. This is solely a different interpretation for how these terms should be defined, but they also happen to be a lot easier to defend than those made by versus battles. But I'll let you be the judge of that. Now, let's get into it. Starting off with the speed tiers that no one really cares about: below average human, normal human, athletic human, peak human, and superhuman level. These are the classifications for each one. Moving on. Now we're getting to the speed tiers that people might actually care about: Subsonic and Subsonic Plus, otherwise known as the speeds where things move faster than the human eye can perceive. Meaning, if you're looking at a race car or a bullet train in a standard direction, they would move across your field of vision as a blur as opposed to a clear image. Subsonic speeds in real life are defined as speeds less than Mach 1. But here, for more clear classifications, subsonic speeds are being around Mach 0.1 to Mach 0.5, and subsonic plus being around Mach 0.5 to Mach 0.9. A Mach number basically quantifies where an object stands in comparison to the speed of sound. For instance, Mach 1 is considered the speed of sound, and being below that, say Mach 0.65, means the object is 65% the speed of sound. However, if you're above Mach 1, say Mach 2, that means you're 2 times the speed of sound. Although the speed of sound differs depending on the temperature and the altitude an object is traveling in, and technically there's no such thing as a fixed speed of sound, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just consider Mach 1, or the speed of sound, to be 330 meters per second. Then we get into transonic, or otherwise defined as approaching to just surpassing the speed of sound, which is Mach 0.9 to Mach 1.1, or 308.7 to 377.3 meters per second. There's not much else to say about this particular speed tier, so let's move on. Next, we move on to Supersonic and Supersonic Plus. aka the speeds in which are often referred to when objects, or fictional characters in this case, are traveling faster than the speed of sound, which most often results in the creation of a sonic boom. Supersonic speeds are classified as going at Mach 1.1 to 2.5, and Supersonic Plus being classified as going Mach 2.5 to Mach 5. To put things into a real-life perspective, most fighter aircrafts and spacecrafts are considered to be able to fly at supersonic speeds. Bullets firing from a gun fly at supersonic speeds, with some rifles being able to shoot projectiles even exceeding Mach 3. So if you're wondering where bullet speed characters would often go, they would be placed here. Next, we'll get into hypersonic speeds, and all the way up to high hypersonic plus. For the sake of brevity, I'll be combining all the hypersonic tiers into one section with the differentiating stats being labeled here. Hypersonic speeds are often defined as speeds starting at Mach 5 and beyond that, in this case, the peak being Mach 100, or traveling 100 times the speed of sound. In other words, hypersonic is essentially supersonic, but on steroids. To again put things into a real-life perspective, the longest commercial flight in the US is a flight from Seattle to Miami, and vice versa. If you were to travel at hypersonic speeds, you'd be able to complete that journey in around 50 minutes, when the average commercial jets would complete that in around 6 hours and 40 minutes. Also keep in mind that Earth's escape velocity, which usually averages around having to travel 11,186 meters per second, only falls under the classification of being high hypersonic. So yeah, we still got a lot of ground to cover, so please bear with me. Next, we go on to massively hypersonic to massively hypersonic plus, which refers to speeds going at Mach 100 to Mach 1000, and then Mach 1000 all the way up to Mach 8810.2. So while the previous speed tiers were based off of IRL speeds and their categorizations, this is more of a community-given term for speeds between high hypersonic plus and sub-relativistic. However, both of these speed tiers are most often referred to as speed tiers for lightning timers. Now, although there are many prerequisites and rules when it comes to calculating lightning in fiction, and especially in real life, heck, it might even deserve its own video. But for the sake of brevity, I'll be going off of this study provided by Versus Battles on their lightning feats page, where they have the average speed of lightning being around Mach 1294 or 4,400,000 meters per second. Now we're finally getting into the speed tiers where the main topic becomes the speed of light rather than the speed of sound, as we get into sub-relativistic and relativistic plus. And for the sake of brevity, we're going to be doing the same thing with relativistic speeds as we did with hypersonic speeds, and leave the stats here. Now obviously the term relativistic is derived from the theory of relativity, but moving at relativistic speeds is often defined as moving at speeds that are a significant fraction of the speed of light, which kindly leads into the literal speed of light, which, unlike the speed of sound, is not dependent on the medium through which something travels through. In a vacuum, it is known as a universal physical constant that always sits at the exact value of 299,792,458 meters per second. In special relativity, the speed of light is often regarded as c, otherwise known as the upper limit of speed at which information in conventional matter can travel. C most obviously being famously found in the equation E equals mc squared, or the energy mass equivalence equation. Now, this is where some people feel like it should stop, because supposedly it's impossible to travel faster than light in real life, therefore we can disregard any feat in fiction that goes beyond that. Hopefully, I don't have to fully explain here how this argument is just fundamentally wrong, dumb, and most of all, ignorant. However, a lot of people have trouble with explaining away this particular argument, and I do plan to make a whole video dedicated to responding to that, but I'll summarize it all in one sentence here. If a fictional verse applies a contradiction to how the real world works, for example a character going faster than light, then said contradicted law therefore doesn't exist within that fictional verse. Got it? Well, too bad. Ask me in the comments or wait till the video comes out, because we're moving on. Now, we're in the category of being considered faster than light, or FTL for short. Again, for the sake of brevity, here are the differentiating stats for each one. So what's beyond being able to move at massively faster than light speeds? Well, now we're getting into what could be considered the main focus of this video. in which we will be discussing the 4 tiers of speed that go beyond finite quantification. And to help better explain these tiers, as I did in a previous video, we will be using the speed equation to better extrapolate and justify not only their existence in fictional power scaling, but also what places one above the other. Starting off with the first of these speed tiers, that is often known as infinite speed. As the name suggests, it is the ability to move and or travel an infinite distance in any finite amount of time. So what does that mean exactly? Well, say a character is able to travel from point A to point B, which we will say is an infinite distance across. If the character arrives at point B within any finite amount of time, let's say 3 seconds, they will qualify for being pretty high into infinite speed. And if you're aware of basic mathematics, infinite divided by 3, or any finite number for that matter, is still infinite. Of course, to be considered higher up in this tier, you'd have to complete an infinite distance in a shorter amount of time than your opponent. So what's wrong with versus Battle Wiki's definition? Well, as of the recording of this video, they have infinite speed as able to travel anywhere instantly or move an infinite distance within a finite amount of time. Teleportation does not count. So other than the parts that exist within our definition, let's talk about these 2 sections of their definition. They are correct that teleportation shouldn't count, but I feel like I need to elaborate here on what they mean. If a character uses teleportation at all to aid themselves in traveling an infinite distance, that wouldn't classify them as having infinite speed because they're using teleportation, which is an ability and or technique that often allows a character to travel from point A to point B instantaneously. In other terms, you didn't travel from point A to point B by using your raw speed alone. They use an entirely separate means of traveling that has nothing to do with how fast you're moving. This also goes for every single speed tier as well, so keep that in mind. Which leads into the other section of their definition, that traveling anywhere instantly is apparently a qualification for infinite speed. So what's exactly wrong with this? Well, let me ask you this. How do you define traveling somewhere in an instant? Most of the time, especially in fiction, they use the phrase traveling somewhere instantly in a very hyperbolic manner to vaguely tell the audience, this guy is going really, really fast. Or, they move so fast, the only way I can describe it is that they traveled there instantly. You can often see those cases in fights where one character is so much faster than the other, he can only describe it as if they were like traveling there in an instant. Essentially, referring to how much faster the opposing character is moving from their perspective and in comparison to how fast they are themselves. Which can be classified as speed blitzing, which is a term often used to describe character A is moving so fast that character B can barely react or not be able to react at all. Essentially, the phrase moving somewhere instantly is almost never really used in a literal sense to describe how fast a character is moving, especially when the word instant is such a vague term in itself. It's really hard to give a definite speed to define itself. I even looked into definitions for the word instant, and many definitions either described it as getting somewhere in a very short time frame, or even an infinitesimal short space of time. Oh look, that term has infinite in it, so that should be enough, right? Well, let's double check its definition just in case. Oh, infinitesimal just means extremely small or a value approaching 0. So even when trying to give it the benefit of the doubt, this section of the definition is evidently too vague to be made a blatant classification for having infinite speed. Therefore, this aspect of the definition is invalid. So, with that out of the way, let's tackle the other common arguments that are often being used to either invalidate this tier as a whole and or invalidate the other tiers being above infinite speed. Obviously, when it comes to determining what is beyond finite quantification, the number of infinity always comes up, as it is often referenced as something that is endless or larger than any real or natural number. However, it's not often made clear to people how we deal with quantifying the value of infinity in terms of power scaling, especially when there are groups of people and even some uneducated mathematicians that either believe 1. Nothing is beyond infinite, 2. The only infinity that exists is a true infinity, and 3. Infinity is not a number, it is an idea or concept. Those who believe in any of these arguments most likely are not familiar and or don't understand the idea of set theory. Now, please bear with me, as I'll try to make this as brief and as digestible as possible. Set theory is a branch in mathematical logic that studies the concept of sets. A set being a collection/groupings of objects, numbers, or even ideas that are grouped together to be considered a single entity. Example being, a class can often be described as a set of students, which, with an individual item in a set, the student in this case, is called an element of a set. In set theory, sets can be either finite or infinite. In the case of infinite, if you include a set of all odd numbers, how long would that set be? It would be infinite in size, obviously. And the same can be said for a set of all even numbers, right? And a half of infinity is also infinite. So what happens when you have a set of all real numbers, which would include all odd or even numbers? The infinite set of all real numbers would then be considered as a higher level of infinity, as it would be considered to be twice as large in comparison to either subset alone, even though both subsets alone would be considered to be infinite. In a nutshell, we use set theory to help better explain the existence of both levels of infinity and the concept of countable infinities within fiction. So hopefully, we now all have a better understanding on how to better interpret the number of infinity within Powerscaling. Now, let's get into why it's below these three other tiers of speed. Next, we have the tier of speed that Versus Battles doesn't even believe exists currently, otherwise known as Inaccessible speed. Inaccessible speed being defined as moving and or traveling any length of distance in zero amount of time. But in order to better implement it into the speed equation, we'd have to switch it around so that distance equals speed multiplied by time. So even if we insert the number of infinity into the speed equation, an infinite amount of zeros does not equal to anything greater than zero. This also helps better explain why bringing up set theory earlier was incredibly relevant, as those who believe that infinity is not a number are the same people that claim that you can't take infinity and multiply it by zero. If they understood or believed in set theory, this wouldn't be an issue, as I've already explained. However, you may be wondering why it should be called inaccessible speed, and where that is derived from. Well, it's derived from the term and would also be the speed equivalent to an inaccessible cardinal, which also happens to come from set theory. Let me explain. To add on what I've already said concerning set theory, it's now more relevant to establish what you need to know when trying to understand an inaccessible cardinal is. Firstly, what is a cardinal or a cardinal number? A cardinal number refers to when we equate numbers to the size of a group of things and are measuring a set of elements. As we already learned, elements are the individuals within a set. For example, if I have 4 cars, the 4 as a whole is being used as a cardinal number in this case, because it's being used to describe and measure how many cars are contained within this finite set. So essentially, an inaccessible cardinal is a cardinal that cannot be accessed. In set theory, there is a concept known as Aleph null. An Aleph null is basically the smallest possible infinite set, and only represents the set of all natural numbers. The idea of inaccessible speed is that no matter how many sets you try and add on to this, you'll never be able to achieve what is known as an inaccessible cardinal. Essentially, a character with any level of finite speed, all the way up to infinite speed, would not be able to move in 0 time, because 0 overrides infinity. 0 times infinity is still 0. So even if you have infinite speed, you still require a finite amount of time to move, and seeing as there's no time, those characters would be unable to do so. What I'm getting at is, the difference between an infinite speed character and an inaccessible speed character would be beyond an infinite distance. My problem with Versus Battles, especially when it comes to inaccessible speed, is that if you look in this content revision thread, which I'll be linking to in the description, where they essentially imply that they believe both inaccessible speed and infinite speed would technically fall within the same category, in which I believe I not only provided a more valid argument for why that shouldn't be the case, but I have also demonstrated that simply believing in this would indicate that they truly do not understand how both the difference and the gap between the smallest countable infinity and an inaccessible cardinal. Speaking of Versus Battle, what are some of the other ways to classify a character for having inaccessible speed that they personally don't believe in? Well, let's take a look at Note 4 and Note 5 on their speed page, where they essentially say that both moving in a timeless void and moving within stop time don't grant someone inaccessible speed or even infinite speed. Firstly, a timeless void, as it sounds, is a place where time does not exist. What that means is, if a character is bound by time in a sense where they can't move without time being present, they wouldn't be able to move within that void. Because again, time doesn't exist there, and unless time exists, they can't move. However, if they're able to move within that realm solely due to their sheer movement speed, giving them the ability to do so, that would qualify them for having inaccessible speed. Because again, it's solely due to how fast they are that they are capable of moving within said realm. It is not due to a special resistance and or ability that the character has that allows them the ability to move within it. Which leads into their next point about the rules of moving within time stop. So obviously, if time has been stopped, then time would inherently equal to 0. So although a character can qualify for having inaccessible speed if they're able to move around during time stop due to how fast they are, but qualifications would not be met if it was a result of a special ability and or trait that gives them a special resistance to time stopping abilities. In other words, simply having a resistance doesn't mean you inherently now have inaccessible speed. However, having inaccessible speed indicates that you inherently have some level of resistance to time stop because you are just that fast. Now, something you might start noticing is once you go beyond infinite speed, not only is the distance you travel less and less relevant, but the numbers that represent the amount of time passing are getting smaller and smaller. But how do you go beyond traveling in 0 time? Well, that's when we get introduced to the ability to arrive before you even leave. In other words, traveling in a negative amount of time, otherwise known as immeasurable speed, or the ability to move and or travel any length of distance in a negative amount of time. The reason we call it immeasurable is mainly due to how negatives play in the speed equation. When you introduce negative numbers, let's say for instance -1 into the speed equation, it essentially would mean that time is undefined, since literally traveling anywhere in negative seconds is practically impossible to calculate mathematically. Therefore, the speed cannot be measured, hence the name immeasurable speed. Now, although I do believe this definition still works, however, it was mainly put out there for consistency's sake, and there are many other ways to help better describe and or classify characters for having this level of speed. Let's go over them. Immeasurable speed, in a literal sense, is time traveling via sheer speed alone, as in they're running so fast that they can travel either backwards or forwards in time, meaning they literally have the ability to travel beyond linear time, or better yet, they can move and or travel throughout all of time. But to make it clear again, this is only due to their speed. Abilities do not count, as characters who travel throughout time via teleportation or portals sometimes get confused for having immeasurable speed. So now we've covered traveling infinite distances, moving in 0 time and or no time at all, and even traveling beyond time itself. But what can possibly be above traveling throughout all of time with nothing holding you back? Well, it's time to talk about the speed tier that is literally named after the idea of the very concept of speed itself being considered irrelevant to you. A speed so fast that both sides of the speed equation don't even apply to the character's movement. Let's talk about irrelevant speed, which entails that you are qualitatively beyond both the concept of distance and the concept of time. A speed which is defined as moving and or traveling so fast that a character's movement transcends the very concept of speed itself. But if you look at Versus Battle's definition for irrelevant speed, it is basically referred to as the speed for only outer-versal characters, which are basically beings that transcend both the concept of time and space, which also entails that they transcend the concept of dimensions. Now, while it is true that outer-versal beings most often have irrelevant speed, it is not true that an outer-versal character inherently has irrelevant speed, nor is it untrue that a character who is not outer-versal can have irrelevant speed as well. The reasoning for this is that it is possible for a non-universal character to have speed that is transcendent of the concept of speed, while simultaneously this same character in of themselves does not transcend the concepts of space or dimensions. And this is also applicable to outerversal characters as well, because there could be an outerversal character that is transcendent of space but also lacks speed that is transcendent over the concept of speed. For example, the Flash from DC is able to run to the source, which as a low end is more than an outerversal distance away from the local multiverse, is an example of a character having irrelevant speed without being outerversal. If a character is destroyed in outerversal sized realm, but has not demonstrated speed feats of any kind, then that'd be an example of an outerversal character that doesn't have irrelevant speed. However, I do want to point out that these kinds of instances are not only incredibly rare, but is also pretty goofy as well. It's like a character having the ability to destroy a universe, but has like human level durability. It's just a level weird that makes people really question power scaling as a whole, and sometimes decide to not even touch power scaling because trying to defend characters that are just coincidentally that weird is just a lot of work. And outerversal characters who don't have irrelevant speed would have to be immobile to make any kind of sense. Mobile, also known as the speed equivalent to a tree, which is none. But wait a minute, where's Omnipresence? Shouldn't that be the highest speed tier? This is such a huge misconception, but I understand where the confusion comes from. Let's start off by defining Omnipresence. It's the property to be present everywhere and anywhere at the same time, or less broadly, the state of being widespread and constantly encountered. This may sound impressive on the surface, but let's extrapolate the definition and give a few examples for why it isn't. Technically, I or any living being would be considered to be present everywhere or anywhere throughout their entire body. And let's say you're literally a universe. You would be considered omnipresent throughout the entire universe. As you are literally the universe and everything in it, you would feel everything that is going on, and as the definition goes, you are literally everywhere at once. What I'm getting at is that omnipresence, or being omnipresent, is not a speed. It is, as defined, a state of being, which relates to the physical condition of a person, meaning you experience it all the time. It's by definition a part of your physical self. Speed only refers to a character's ability to move and operate. For example, humans and cats have the ability to move on their own because their state of being allows them to, while trees, for instance, don't have the ability to move on their own because their state of being literally prevents them from doing so. If you think about it, being considered omnipresent would be more detrimental than if anything. Because if we go back to you embodying a universe and say I'm inside you, I can literally attack you anywhere and everywhere and hit you every single time. Since again, you are omnipresent throughout the entire universe, you cannot dodge me if you are physically everywhere and anywhere at once. There is also a common misconception surrounding omnipresence, specifically the idea if a character is omnipresent, say for example throughout a universe, that they would be omnipresent everywhere else. Omnipresence in all cases does not embody the entirety of existence and can be limited to certain spaces. A famous example of this is one of the primary villains from Spawn, Malbolgia, who is omnipresent throughout his own realm, but nowhere else. Well, anyway, that's it for the video. This video took a lot longer than expected, but I hope I did my job and helped you learn more about all the different speed tiers. If you happen to become more intrigued about learning the other complexities of speed scaling, know that I have another video in the works delving more into that. I also have a video concerning gag characters and power scaling that will be coming out soon, as well as future collaborations with my boy Noodles. If you want to be notified as soon as those videos come out, please subscribe to my channel, smash the bell icon, and follow me on Twitter. I can comment down below for any videos that you want to see in the near future, but until then, thank you all for watching, and class is dismissed.